welcome to Dr. Santushi Amarasuriya from the University of Colombo and Dr. Igor Grossman from the University of Waterloo, who are here to do our final seminar of this term. Dr. Santushi is a senior lecturer at the Department of Medical Humanities in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, in which she has been on the academic staff since 2006. She is a clinical psychologist by profession and obtained her PhD from the University of Melbourne in 2016. She is the project director of Project Measuring and Developing Wisdom in Sri Lanka and the Philippines, funded by a Global Innovations for Character Development grant through the Templeton World Charity Foundation. Igor Grossman is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Waterloo, Canada, where he leads the Wisdom and Culture Lab. As a behavioral social scientist, Grossman has been working on demystifying what makes up a wise judgment in the context of revolving societal and cultural changes. His chief work aims to uncover misconceptions about wisdom and societal change and identifying cultural and psychological processes that enable people to think and act wisely. Tonight, they will both speak to us about North America, Philippines, and Sri Lanka, gains in wisdom of difficult experiences. So I would like to pass the microphone over to Igor and Santushi.
Well, thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to conclude your wonderful series. And both Santushi and I are delighted to present the ongoing research that we have had over the course of the last several years. We started before the pandemic, and then the pandemic made it even more significant in Philippines and Sri Lanka, as well as some of the other related research that I have done in my lab, and as well as colleagues elsewhere. I will start this presentation and then we'll continue with Santushi's part, but I will explain that in a second. Let me get started by pointing out the world that we live in today. There are devastating natural disasters. There are geopolitical tensions within and across countries, and of course, there has been a global pandemic. In moments of adversity, such as geopolitical, intergroup conflict-related adversity, or pandemic adversities, we often turn to ways to make sense of the world that is often selfless, or to find wisdom in navigating the challenges ahead. But sometimes, and especially over the pandemic, it seems like folk beliefs about wisdom have turned this quest upside down. Instead of seeking wisdom in moments of adversity, some have claimed that wisdom comes from adversity. And this is not a new sentiment. A classic German proverb states that adversity is the mother of wisdom. And certainly in the Western Christian canon, the notion of adversity and wisdom appears quite intertwined, such that some even state that adversity is a way to find God's attention. In other words, to live a virtuous God-inspired life.
Los datos, entonces por eso no quise tampoco darle.
No, igual soy yo.
Maybe somebody's talking there. All right. One example of adversity that is very close to my heart is coming from the horrible situation many people in Europe live through right now. Consider just last week. I was born in Ukraine. I have family there, and when I remember what happened last week, when I was glued to the screen, or when I was following live broadcasts of rocket shelling of Kiev, I sensed horror. And I also sense this sense of awe, not awe in a positive sense, how you often experience it, but just this horrible grandness of the tragedy that is happening in front of my eyes. And I imagine the adversity that many people in Ukraine are and will continue to be experiencing over the course of the next years. And the question to me has been, will I, as somebody who lived there, who has relatives there, or the people right there, many of whom are now refugees in Europe, gain some wisdom from these experiences? Will I, my relatives and friends, refugees from Ukraine in Poland, Germany, and elsewhere, get wiser through suffering? And the answer to this question is undoubtedly very, very complicated. And obviously, I was very skeptical of that. At this point, it's worth taking a step back. There is a universal truth, potentially, that is culturally mediated through religious and folk psychological beliefs. That would be one position. Or is it that the idea that wisdom comes from or via mastering adversity or some challenging life experiences specific to a particular Judeo-Christian cultural context that many of us in Western Europe and North America live in? Now, here it's worth considering that big gods, as my friend Aaron Aronzine calls them, who bring in adversity, often instill awe in doing so, just like that preacher in the quote that I showed you earlier suggests, when he says that the God sort of like makes us suffer to remind us of himself. Awe is common in many religions, and that would suggest that it may be something universal. But at the same time, maybe the way how gods are treating awe and what exactly they do with it can vary quite dramatically. Here, it's also important to say that awe, by the way, is not something that is only associated with pleasant experiences. It's often a misconception. It often has been associated with also negative experiences. And in fact, in Judeo-Christian tradition, when you think about an awe-inspiring God, especially in the Old Testament, we likely emphasize the negative. And indeed, there is some emerging body of research that suggests that just the experience of awe can promote some aspects that we would probably universally characterize as related to wisdom. So I will get to that in a minute. That is, awe may be associated with greater humility and a sense of smaller self, as some of my colleagues at Berkeley and University of Toronto have pointed out. But really, they unpack the cultural lens of the relationship between wisdom and adversity. We need to consider different perspectives of how to approach this question in the first place. What do we mean by the role of culture? Typically, in cultural psychology, there are two equally strong traditions. One is called the etic tradition, and it assumes that the meaning of phenomenon is a universal. It assumes that you can, if after you establish some kind of universal understanding of what the phenomenon is about, you can then study cultural differences concerning the magnitude, expression, or relationship of different processes such as wisdom and adversity, but not the phenomenon itself. The phenomenon remains stable. It would allow you for some form of cross-cultural comparison. On the other hand, there is an emic tradition in anthropology, where you would assume that there is quite radical variability in understanding of a phenomenon, or at least before you start studying the phenomenon, you would not know if the meaning of what you're studying is the same in different parts of the world. Then here, cultural differences would start with the beliefs and the meaning of particular terms, not just the magnitude of psychological expression of those terms or how they relate to other concepts. So here, before you would understand how wisdom may be related to adversity, challenging life experiences, you would first need to understand how wisdom and adversity are in fact understood in the first place. And you need to take sort of an insider perspective to study unique cultural experiences. In addition to this cultural lens, as a psychologist, both Santushi and I think that it's important to consider the psychological perspectives. And in clinical psychology, many people would be out of job if everybody would have experienced adversity similarly. We know that that's not the case. Mastery of adversity often depends on particular strategies that you use for navigating it. It's about how you work through difficult life experiences. One example for differences in coping, for instance, involves the notion of immersing yourself or distancing when reflecting on the experiences. Reflection on the experience can often lead to prolonged sense of depression and further exacerbate the traumatic experiences you have experienced in the first place. But it's not always the case. And in fact, some suggest that if you reflect and you write down the diary, that can help you to work through those negative experiences. So how can that be? Well, on the one hand, you can immerse yourself when you reflect. You can relive it through your own eyes. Imagine this is Susie, you focus on your conflict with Susie, you just had a conflict with her, and you narrow in on that experience. You see her, your vision narrows, your body starts to shake again like you shaked during the conflict. All the blood gets back into your head and so on. You don't see anything else that may have contributed to Susie reacting so adversely towards you. And of course, you want to react in kind. Or you can take a step back. And sometimes when we reflect, we do take a step back. And you consider the fact that maybe you have also contributed to making Susie angry in the first place. Maybe it was you who have started the conversation. Maybe there's a bigger picture context that have contributed towards this animosity, to this form of adversity that you have experienced. And there are individual differences. And it turns out that this type of distance reflection can often help work through difficult life experiences in a way how an immersed reflection cannot. So when we say adversity may be promoting wisdom, well, which way of handling adversity do we mean here? Okay, so bringing these two ideas together about the cultural variation, even understanding and approaching cultural variation and the psychological variation, in the paper today, we will present two approaches. First, we'll focus on the ethic approach, and that's what I will be talking about. I will present you recent advances in trying to get to the bottom of what are the agreed on definitions of wisdom across psychology and education, and what is the role of adversity, particularly economic adversity, but also different types of adversity for wisdom, particularly in North American context. And then we switch gears, and Santushi will take this kind of amic approach that her and I and several of our colleagues have been working on, where we'll focus on beliefs about wisdom in Philippines and Sri Lanka, and it will include some focus group discussions, and we will also hopefully finish on discussing some of the methodological challenges of doing this much more laborious work. Okay, let me start by talking a little bit about this common wisdom model and the reason for it. When we talk about wisdom in general, even in sciences, among scientists, even though it's been discussed through millennia, only recently psychologists became interested in it. And because research is in its infancy, and it's a complex construct, interest in wisdom has been marked by confusion. Or what psychologists would call jingle and jangle fallacies. An example of confusion in psychology that is not necessarily about wisdom is the topic of empathy. Do we actually mean compassion or sympathy? And depending on your philosophical tradition, you may be interpreting it differently. Or humility. Do you mean the social humility? Just be nice to other people, or like not to show off? Or do you mean the intellectual humility, where you can still be prickly socially, but nevertheless intellectually inquisitive, including inquisitive of your own beliefs? Or how about concept of mindfulness? Is it about engagement, or is it about stress relief? So there are a lot of concepts that we have in social sciences that are very challenging to characterize in the same fashion. And there's a lot of confusion about it, which is dangerous because it leads literally to some kind of scientific version of the Tower of Babel, where different people talk about different things, and there is no advance, and it will just crumble because people interpret things differently. It becomes a little bit more of a hermeneutic enterprise instead of actually quantitative social science. And so to address that for wisdom, or at least start to address that for wisdom, several years ago, in 2019, I assembled a wisdom task force, inviting all major key players, including those with quite adversarial views, to join me for a day-long meeting in Toronto. And as a preparation for our meeting, we surveyed over 50 academic groups from around the world about the conceptual and working definitions of wisdom. And I expect a lot of disagreement, and these definitions were then coded subsequently by independent raters. And it turns out I was pretty much wrong. There was quite a bit of agreement on a particular set of characteristics. As you can see on the top here, people mention prosocial features, moral disposition, sympathy, but they also mention things that we ended up calling metacognitive features. That is balancing, perspective taking, considering the context, recognizing limits of your knowledge, so epistemic or intellectual humility. And those are the features that actually, and managing uncertainty, those are features that appear in most of the measures of wisdom that are currently being used in social and behavioral sciences. And this results, by the way, are not idiosyncratic. For instance, over the course of the pandemic, when I conducted a series of interviews with world's leading academics about the consequences of the pandemic, I also asked the question, what kind of wisdom do you need to prevent the negative and support the positive consequences? And now, these are the people, most of whom had never heard of the wisdom science before. And nevertheless, when we looked at the conceptual sort of themes that emerge and how they relate to each other, here the similar coded themes reflect groups from hierarchical cluster analysis, and this represent the associations, the strength of the relationship between them. You can see that there is strong focus on metacognitive themes, such as balancing of diverse interests, perspective taking, self-distancing, compassion, context sensitivity, that appear quite frequently, along with the moral themes once again. And so this is coming not necessarily from wisdom scholars, but from world scientific elite, so to say, in social behavioral sciences. About morals, what do scientists mean by morals? When they say that wisdom, for instance, has some kind of moral connotation, well, it turns out they often talk about shared humanity, pursuit of truth, which is quite interesting. It's not something that many psychologists right now think about. Well, until the misinformation, they didn't think much about it. Now, many scholars think about that. And common good orientation and balance of self-protection and other orientation. I also asked, what is common good orientation? Turns out that by that, they actually meant the same shared humanity and balance of self-protection and other orientations, more like some kind of a combination of those terms. And so in short, and this is something that you can read in this psychological inquiry target issue and commentaries on it, we propose that a plausible, empirically plausible construct of wisdom that is much more ethic in its orientation would be focusing on metacognition and certain moral concerns, but also that the manifestation of these features requires consideration of contextual, cultural, experiential factors. Now, metacognition is a mouthful, so I also call it wise reasoning sometimes, for the lack of better terms. And the reason for the convergence on such forms of reasoning and morality, as we propose, comes from different angles. It requires, in order to be acting in a morally fashion, you need to implement, in order to implement these abstract moral principles, you need these forms of wise reasoning. They're sort of enabling it to situate morality in the context of everyday life. It allows you to see through illusion and self-deception, so satisfying this pursuit of truth, moral orientation. And it also, evolutionary may be assisting on in the survival-oriented coordination. So if you consider perspectives of others, try to figure out how they're different from yours, recognize your limitations, it may help you to plan better for the future in a context of uncertainty. And for a long period of time, humans, of course, lived in a context of quite radical uncertainty. Okay, so that's the model that we propose, but like this is sort of like the jump board for this ethic approach. Now, when in that type of stream of research, we talk about the relationship between adversity and wisdom. One idea that may be very interesting is the concept of economic adversity. This is something that does not only apply when we compare it across cultures. Some societies are much more affluent than others, of course, but also within societies, and especially in the US, where there's quite an incredible income inequality. We can examine the question how economic adversity may be related to wisdom. And some of the findings here are quite surprising. So I will focus for just a few minutes on those. This is, by the way, the work that I've done with my former student, Justin Brienza, who is now a professor at University of Queensland. So the question is, how do people with or without socioeconomic adversity vary in their reasoning? So it's a bigger picture question, and it's a question that has spanned the whole enterprise and education industry, studying intelligence. The very beginning of the research on intelligence as a psychometric construct goes back to Alfred Binet, who develops a measure of children's mental age for educational placement. And the tasks they typically developed were specific for kids from particular environments. And for Binet, it was very important to pay attention to the cultural context, where he really emphasized the need for a wide range of measures due to wider range of intelligences, as some of the biographers of Binet later pointed out in his writing. And he never assumed that you can just take the same test and measure people from a different environment and assume that it would mean the same thing for this different people. Now, to give you an example of this classic reasoning task, he would have those drawings of different women, and he would ask, well, which of these pictures is prettier? And now, if you are somebody from Western European, North American context, you may think maybe the one on the top left, or the one in the center, or maybe top, or maybe the bottom left, or maybe the one in the center right, but surely not others. But that's actually quite substantial. There's substantial cultural variability in that, and in some societies where, especially those that don't have as much food available immediately, different forms of beauty may be apparent or may be desired. So the answer, of course, to this question can vary quite dramatically, not because of some differences in intelligence, just because the cultures would differ. And now, never mind this initial cultural considerations. The way the story of intelligence research went was that American psychologists decided to adopt Binet's test that was further developed by his student Simon. And they were very interested in using some kind of mass scale industrial testing of class distinction. Louis Terman in particular, as well as Henry Goddard. And by the way, they were not the only ones. I mean, of course, they were part of the whole eugenics movement that was dominant in social sciences at the beginning of the 20th century, both in Europe and in North America. Something that many North American scholars that wanted to forget after the Second World War. But the way it went was that, for instance, Terman even says that to curtail the reproduction of feeble-mindedness and the elimination of the enormous amount of crime, pauperism, and industrial inefficiency, we should identify who is not smart enough and then just, not allow them to have kids, for instance. So that's how it went. Now, that's, of course, just one perspective. It goes completely contrary to initial sentiment that Binet had. And so one idea that we had was to really go back to Binet's ideas and say, okay, if you think about ecology, and if you think about the concept of wisdom and reasoning, wise reasoning, in a broader term, we need to consider what kind of ecology people in low socioeconomic status who experience adversity, economic adversity, live in, and how it differs from the environment of high socioeconomic individuals, where we would posit, like Binet, that class-specific behaviors are adaptations to different environments. And now, what do we know about social ecology of social class? Well, first of all, behaviors that at first glance may appear as poorly reasoned may be actually adaptive responses to resource-related ecological constraints faced by people from low socioeconomic status. For instance, there's this major finding, pretty robust finding, at least in North American context, that people from low socioeconomic environment don't delay, and instead of that, they would, for instance, their impulse control is worse because they would take something right away instead of waiting longer and getting two pieces of the same thing in tests. But is it rational for them to wait if they think that the environment is so uncertain that tomorrow may not happen, or that other people try to screw them over all the time, where they feel like it's all very hostile and it's not safe to wait longer? Some scholars suggest that it's not the case, that instead you may be actually better off rationally to take that thing that you're provided immediately. And there's also other elements to it. Resource scarce ecology of working class has been also linked to focus on close relationships and in-group cooperation. If you don't have money to, get a mechanic to fix your car, you better have really good relationships with your neighbor who's a mechanic, or who may know something about mechanics, who can help you to fix the car. There is also evidence of greater vigilance to social cues and contextual cues that are not even social in nature, and that's some of the work that I have done. At the same time, there's evidence that more educated, affluent environments are more likely to promote this kind of immersed, egocentric self-focus. And that may not necessarily be adaptive for this type of forms of wisdom. So we decided to test this. And to test this first, we developed a measure. We developed it because we wanted to have a good, reliable measure, state-specific metric of wise reasoning. And the idea here is that you first recount an autobiographical experience, recent interpersonal conflict, then you reconstruct this experience, and then you answer a set of questions about your reflection on this experience. It's about concrete events. It's not about some general dispositions or about some general beliefs about yourself. It's about what you remember doing. And it has been validated now in this actually, the old data has been tested in many societies with pretty good evidence of robustness, actually. And now it's available in actually more languages if you're interested, but it has been linked to things that it's supposed to be linked, including reduced bias and more balance in inferences and goals, and even attenuated intergroup conflict. Okay, so what do we find when we measure people's responses on this ethic measure of wisdom, if you want, and socioeconomic standing? This is a graph showing we had people from different states and how affluent those states were in the United States based on the number of people who are unemployed and other available resources and the performance on this measure. And as you can see, there's a strong negative relationship suggesting that the more affluent the state, the less likely they are to report these forms of reasoning in the interpersonal conflicts. We found similar effects for individual level, occupational status, education, income, where higher levels of income and education together were negatively linked to performance. And this is, by the way, controlling for all sorts of additional measures. And we also found a similar effect on the state-specific level. When people reported that they had a conflict with somebody who had the highest status than them, they were more likely to show wise reasoning than when they had higher status than the other person whom they had a conflict with. So it's kind of interesting. And finally, we replicated it. We had another study where we got a random sample from Michigan, And people recalled both intergroup and interpersonal conflicts. And here, this is important because this ecological perspective about socioeconomic advantage of people in adversity condition only applies to context where it matters, namely interpersonal context. In intergroup context, that does not necessarily matter for their survival. They should not necessarily be performing any different from other groups because it doesn't necessarily help them to think differently about conflicts, about, for instance, between Ukrainians and Russians. And now, in this case, we actually used open-ended reflections, which were then subsequently quantified. And we also had measures of intelligence to control for that. And what we find is on the measures of intelligence, higher education, of course, is linked to higher scores of measures of intelligence, the standard measures of intelligence following this kind of Simon Binet tradition and later adopted by eugenic scientists in North America. But when we look at wise reasoning, we find the opposite pattern where people with in fact, the reverse pattern where people with no college education are more likely to report wise reasoning, but only about interpersonal conflicts. And intergroup conflicts, there was indeed no difference between them, consistent with this ecological perspective. So this is a little bit about the role of economic adversity. And if you want to know more, this has been published several years ago in Oral Proceedings B. Another little bit very briefly about different types of adversity and wisdom comes from, as well as the role of self-distancing as a possible individual difference measure, comes from a longitudinal study that my colleagues and I have done over the course of the last several years in Canada, as well as in the US. And here we recruited a sample of 5,000 North American workers to take part in a 4-wave year-long study. And the idea was that every 3 months they would be sampled about most difficult adversity they have experienced. They would be recalling this event, reconstruct it, reflect on it. Then we would be using this measure for wise reasoning that I presented earlier, and they would also rate their self-distancing. And we were also able to quantify, qualify what kind of events, what kind of forms of adversity they experienced. And by the way, this project, this particular paper was led by my former postdoc, Anna Dorfman, who's now Bar-Ilan University in Israel. So we asked people to describe the event and reflect on it. And we got a very rich and diverse set of over 1,000 different events. For instance, one person told us, I had to let go of 2 employees from my business that have been working for me for over 12 years. They were very good. I had nothing to do with it. It has nothing to do with their performance, just with the decrease in my business. I just could not afford their salaries anymore. It was very, very hard. So for this person, it's kind of interpersonal, economic adversity, business is downsizing. I had to let go of probably friends who've been working for over a decade with them. This was one of the events that they mentioned. And then we had this situated wise reasoning scale that I already presented earlier, and which it roughly kind of captures intellectual humility, open-mindedness about how things will change in the future, the consideration of other people's perspectives, and an attempt to find a way to accommodate different sides in an interpersonal or adverse type of situation. Then we had the measure of distancing. I already mentioned that this can be potentially very important when coping with adverse experiences. For instance, we asked people, to what extent did you imagine being somebody else watching the situations, like this kind of mental distancing, fly on the wall vantage point, so to say. Okay, so the next we quantified the type of events or characterized the type of events people reported and looked at the differences in wisdom. And so what we find here is that, first of all, we had quite different types of events. We had social conflicts, personal health related scares like, cancer, economic hardships, other health-related issues, academic challenges, work-related challenges, and major trauma, as defined by classic definition by APA. And what you see is quite a bit of variability. For some of the events, the scores on this wisdom measure were lower. For instance, a major trauma, and but also personal health-related things. For other things like social conflicts and others' health, the measure showed higher performance, relatively higher performance. And what is really interesting is that often those events that those type of adversity that resulted in higher performance were other focused rather than self-focused. We also looked at changes over time and the trajectories. These are individual trajectories. This spaghetti plots show different people and their unique trajectories in this year-long study over time. And as you can see, they're very different trajectories. And even the average trajectories for different individuals vary quite substantially. So talking about like a general relationship between wisdom and adversity becomes almost pointless when you look at this graph, because depending on what kind of adversity you experience, the trajectory may look very, very different. In addition to that, we tried to look at the effect of distancing. Here, one important side note is that we have to distinguish between the between-person variations, so stable dispositions, and how much do they distance in a given moment in a particular event. And a prediction would have been that the more they distant in their reflection in a particular moment, the more it will push them in the direction of their social growth after experiencing adversity. And well, that's to some extent what we found. Generally, distancing was related to greater wisdom, but also there was an interaction with time. But this was only the case for one particular type of conflict, namely a particular type of adversity, namely social conflicts. And this is a Johnson-Newman region of significance plot. Basically, what you see on the right side here is that over time, on the x-axis you see years and quarters, on the y-axis you see wisdom scores. If you're distancing, which is this orange line on the top, then you have a positive trajectory. But if you're like immersing yourself and reflect and ruminate on it, you have a negative trajectory. So that's the first ever evidence of this kind of longitudinal pattern over time that suggests that there is indeed potentially maintenance, at least, of adversity. The effect is very small, as you can see. But for other people, if anything, it leads them to greater trauma, exacerbates the trauma. And so that's a little bit about the ethic approach. But now I'll pass on to Santushi, who is eagerly waiting to tell you a little bit about the emic approach about lay conceptions of wisdom in Sri Lanka and Philippines.
Thanks very much, Igor, and thank you for giving a nice background and framework to what I will be speaking about now. So what I will share with you is some work that Igor and I have been involved in Sri Lanka and the Philippines. If you can move on to the next slide. Just to tell you or give you a bit of what our motivation was for this work done in these two countries. It's quite clear that work and research on wisdom, development of tools, have all originated from affluent parts of North America and Western Europe. So the question remains as to whether what wisdom means the same thing for people across cultures. I mean, even from a symbolism point of view, the wise old owl might make complete sense to somebody in North America, but back here, I don't think it would make much sense to someone. It just would throw someone off. So first of all, this understanding of what is wisdom and what would that be for someone in a different culture. And also, if we were to, let's say Igor did talk about the ethic approach, he talked about universality of definitions. Even if you were to argue that this was so, and even if the definition of wisdom was similar across these different cultures, there could be certain dimensions or certain nuances within the understanding within these cultures, which could once again lead to differences. And if I were to give an example, if you talk about openness, openness might be comprehended like something like novelty seeking, but in another culture, openness might relate more to something like being open to an adverse experience, to uncertainty. So there could be certain dynamics within cultures which could influence the interpretations that people might have of these unique constructs. And also there could be certain environmental factors or cultural factors themselves and experiences which could influence the notions of wisdom. So the topic today regarding adversity and wisdom, could certain adverse experiences lead to different interpretations of wisdom? So this is really our motivation for the project. And if you can move on to the next slide. So this was really a collaboration between 4 universities: the University of Colombo, where I'm working, University of Waterloo, where Igor's at, and University of De La Salle in the Philippines, and Wake Forest University. So we collaborated on this project, measuring and developing the characteristics of wisdom, testing new approaches in Sri Lanka and the Philippines. And we were fortunate to receive funding for the project from the Templeton World Charity Foundation. If we were to think about our final outcome, what we were interested in was to see how we could boost wisdom in these cultures. But we really had to start from the basics because, first of all, we didn't know if conceptions of wisdom align with what was understood about wisdom as stated in previous work. So our project involved several studies involving first an examination of lay conceptions of wisdom, and then proceeding into trying to figure out how you could measure this construct, because this was a precursor to really examine whether certain interventions were effective or not. So what I am going to talk to you today is about the first study, the first level in this project, our study 1, which focused on focus group discussions and lay notions of wisdom in Sri Lanka and the Philippines. So if you can transition. The conceptualization and the formulation of the study was rather challenging because we did have several methodological issues that we were confronted with. Firstly, in Sri Lanka, the term wisdom was well known, but it was well known through the through Buddhism, where wisdom was conceived to be something that was a level or a state that you will achieve on your path to enlightenment. So it was more, it's conceived as more like a process that you might attain through something like meditation. Now, the question was, how useful would this type of definition or understanding be in trying to develop certain interventions from a psychological point of view to boost wisdom in this culture? Similarly, in the Philippines, there was a problem in terms of finding an appropriate term for wisdom. So the terms in lay usage did really not correspond with wisdom. So one common term translated to being street smart, that was not exactly what we were interested in. And the translation of wisdom was very much a technical term that was not in lay usage. So we were confronted with issues of validity. And this led to a lot of discussions amongst the team members. And if we can transition into the next slide, the way we formatted the focus group discussions helped us in navigating these issues somewhat. So in Sri Lanka, as I said, the issue was that the conception of wisdom was something at a higher level, something that was very, very difficult to explain. And in fact, I was rather concerned that when we did do these focus group discussions, could these focus group discussions go along a different path? And what we did is something different from what you might do in a focus group discussion, where you start from more open-ended questions to more closed or specific questions. We flipped this around and we talked about more concrete or specific situations, because our motivation here was to try and develop psychological interventions to boost wisdom. Now, this was not a philosophical debate as to what definition was appropriate. What we were interested in was boosting it in terms of cognitions, emotions, behaviors, because that's the stuff that psychologists are interested in. So what we did was we framed the questions where initially participants were specifically asked to think about an example of a wise person. So it was very concrete, and they went into situations, emotions, behaviors, and how this particular person might solve a problem. The questions then transitioned into broader questions, how wisdom might come about, contributions of wisdom to adversity. And then once again, it narrowed the focus, but it still allowed for broad conceptions of wisdom to come out. And really, this strategy helped us beautifully navigate the problems that we were facing, because I had the opportunity to speak to some of the participants, and they told me that they came into the FGDs very worried as to what they were going to talk about, because this was this thing that was so difficult to attain. It was so difficult to explain. How on earth can I now talk about wisdom in these focus group discussions? And suddenly, these questions helped them frame it and help them operationalize wisdom. And in fact, they suddenly realized, look, I have wise people in my life, and I know what I need to do to become more wise in my approach. Now, the way we structured it also didn't impose sort of forcing them to move along a certain path, because we did allow the participants to once again talk about those broader definitions once they talked about more specific characteristics. So the final part of the focus group discussion was in fact coming up with the definitions of wisdom. And we found that some of them did once again transition back into those higher levels of attainment, whilst some specifically talked about the characteristics of wisdom. Now, from the point of view of the Philippines, who were struggling with coming up with a term for wisdom, after several consultations, they decided to go with the more formal term. And how they navigated this issue was to spend some time initially trying to come up with examples of a wise person, which once again helped them to move along the FGDs. And what they found was, when they went into the more broader definitions of wisdom, it corresponded with understanding of what wisdom might be as found in previous research. So we did find it hard to navigate these issues, but I think finally we were able to sort of come up with good strategies to examine the constructs that we were interested in. So if we can move on to the next slide. So to just give you a sort of a snapshot of what our study samples look like, we conducted 16 focus group discussions in both countries, and mostly university students. In Sri Lanka, we did it in 2 languages, in Sinhala and Tamil, whereas in the Philippines, it was just in Filipino. We tried our level best to have gender, socio-economic status, and religious affiliation matched groups, so that we got sort of a broader discussions going. And we also looked at the demographic variations within the countries and tried to select our participants. Great pains were taken in trying to recruit representative participants to examine this construct. Also, being interested in how socioeconomic disadvantage might also lead to different understanding about wisdom, we also looked at the family income of the students. And as you see, these were students who were from families who were not of a higher socioeconomic status. All right, if you can move on to the next slide. So the FGDs, we had 13 questions over 2.5 to 3 hours. The coding process was extremely interesting. We had very rich data. It was going back and forth, lots of recoding, categorizations. It was a very long, drawn-out process. And we did come up with a lot of characteristics, a lot of behaviors, emotions, and many of them did correspond to what the standardized measures of wisdom identified as characteristics of wisdom, but we also had other characteristics, general characteristics of what a wise person might be. We were interested in measurement here because we were thinking about our later stages in terms of building interventions and trying to measure improvements or changes in wisdom. So we looked at more concrete behaviors, and we identified those items to be incorporated into the situated wise reasoning scale. So there were 21 items identified from the two countries. And apart from that, the other more broader characteristics, which were telling us a lot about understanding of these two populations about wisdom, were incorporated into a new scale, the wise reputation scale, which contained 23 items. So let's just move on to the next slide. So that's just a broad overview as to what our focus group discussions were like. If I now were to focus on the specific question that we tackled in terms of how do daily challenges, problems, adversity, or difficult experiences contribute to becoming wise? And this was one of our focus group discussion questions, which came towards the middle of the discussion after the definition, after talking about the characteristics of wisdom. So I've had a bit of fun with colors here. It looks a bit complicated, but just a very few simple ideas that I'd like to communicate here. What we've got on the left are the percentage of what we've really got are the 10 most prominent themes that came up in the focus group discussions. On the left are the themes that came up in terms of the number of participants who were coming up with these themes, and appreciating that focus group discussions leads to certain group effects where one participant talking about a certain theme leads to everybody talking about it and then inflating that particular theme. We also wanted to look at the occurrence of these particular themes across the FGDs. So as you see, I've color-coded each of the themes that came up. And if you look across the two tables, you look at the placement of the themes, you find that they are quite close by. So there is a correspondence between how participants came up with these SGDs and the frequencies, and how they came up generally within the focus group discussions. And if you just run through some of these, this just gives you a flavor of some of the themes that came up, because these are just the top 10. Leading to self-awareness leads to new learning. You become strong and resilient. You can apply what you know. You enhance decision making, put your knowledge to test, and so on and so forth. So you also notice that a lot of the themes that were coming up in terms of the participant frequencies are coming up in terms of the focus group discussions. And there are a few new themes as well. So this is from the Philippines. And if we move to the next slide, we have data from Sri Lanka. Once again, very similar themes have come up. And there is, once again, good correspondence in terms of the placement of these themes across the two tables. And you do find that there are a few new ones that have come up. It's quite loud and clear in the Sri Lankan data set that the participants were saying that wisdom depends on several factors, depends on how you face the situation, certain personality characteristics, the situation itself. So wisdom doesn't always come about. If you can move on to the next slide, which gives you a flavor of some of these examples. So depends on several factors. It depends on how a person faces a trauma. One person can think it happens to everyone, so I will rise, but another can think of everything that happened to me, that I can't do anything and he can fall. So clearly it qualifies wisdom as something that arises if somebody responds to situations in a particular way. And so that linear relationship between wisdom and adversity was not seen in these responses as well. Wisdom or adversity being essential for wisdom was another thing that was brought up. To become a skilled sailor, you have to have a storm at sea. And it seemed as if they were talking about wisdom or adversity like the canvas on which wisdom could be fostered. It gives you an opportunity to think. It actually gives somebody the space to think about problems, how to solve them. And the more you strike the iron, the stronger it gets. It also sort of links in with the resilience response. But what the particular participant here talks about is that the more external pressures you have, somebody becomes a little more inclined to think about how to deal with the situation. If we can move on to the next slide. Then from the Philippines, we've got examples of how it might lead to new learning. You have a metric to measure what you know based on what you're going through. It's there where you get to challenge your notion of who you are, and if you know what you know about it, this allows you to learn. It also talks about self-awareness. I think they need to go through challenges so they know the outcome. If one does not go through hardships, one would not know if they're strong or weak. They need to go through hardships so that they can be good at it and see their capabilities, what they can withstand in the face of facing obstacles. Let's move on. Decision making. This particular quote was about somebody who came from a village who had lots of friends in the farming community, and how he talks about the fact that when it comes to decision making daily issues in life, that somebody who has gone through adversity is far more skilled at coming up with good decisions because they've made mistakes and they've been through everything. Whereas someone who comes from a more protected environment is not very good at decision making. So adversity does help somebody in decision making. Also making mistakes and learning from them, you become more realistic because you're not always right all the time. At least this lets you know that you are capable of making mistakes and you will take your decisions seriously so that it will lead you to the right path. Experiences leading to learning, some of them actually across the two sites, we found that they talked about experiences like your reference list in life, where you are faced with a problem and you think about how you faced this before and how you are then more successful in facing problems. Right, if we transition. So this just gives you once again a comparison between now the two countries, Sri Lanka and the Philippines. You see that there is quite a lot of similarity in terms of the themes that have come up. If you look at the, so you've got about 6 themes that are similar. And then of course, there are a few new themes, but good correspondence in terms of the participants. And it is very similar in terms of the next slide, which talks about correspondence across the focus groups discussions. So we've got, once again, the themes there: learning from mistakes, opportunity to think, problems, dealing with problems in the future. These were themes that came up only in one site, but then there are several that have come up in both sites. So really, these focus group discussions did tell us that there was a lot of similarity between existing conceptions of wisdom and what these two cultures perceive wisdom to be. There were also certain new elements that were brought in, and also some of, in terms of coping and in terms of dealing with adverse situations, some of those themes did tell us that things like opportunity to think, you think about it, maybe you self-reflect, you distance yourself from an experience. These might be ways of dealing with adversity. We have now moved on into the second study, and we are actually concluding the second part, where we are actually looking at measures and looking at whether moving on into from an emic to an ethic approach, whether existing tools really do work in these cultures, and that would then help us moving forward. So that is what I was hoping to share with you today. I'd just like to acknowledge the Templeton World Charity Foundation for their funding, which enabled us to really do this work, and also to all our collaborators who have been on the project, lots of research assistants spending many hours doing some good work.
Well, thank you, Igor, Santushi, for a terrific presentation. I mean, really so comprehensive and rich and relevant for the world we have today. I would like to open up the floor for questions. I'm sure there are plenty, and if you can't speak, please can you put your question in the chat? John, I'll pass the microphone over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for this talk. I found this absolutely fascinating. Your research is rich conceptually and practically, and empirically rather than practically, and I've learned a hell of a lot. Thank you. There's many things I'd love to ask you, but one in particular is about the possible connection between metacognition, because Igor, you defined wise reasoning partly in terms of, or in some cases perhaps synonymous with, metacognition. And I wondered if you see there being a connection between metacognition as a kind of a character skill and either resilience or grit, and what that conceptual map might look like. And some things some areas have been sketched about that, but I wonder if you could say a little more about its connection between those two character strengths.
Thank you, Jonathan. Without being too critical of resilience or grit, my understanding is that for grit, it's nothing else than just a combination of certain personality characteristics. Even, Angela Duckworth and others would agree to that. It's nothing else than conscientiousness. That's more of a disposition. It's a general individual difference. And I think the way how it is often measured is general disposition, individual difference. Whereas metacognition is more about the process, about how you're facing a difficult situation and how you work through it. How do you deal with adversity? Now, resilience is an interesting construct that is subject to the same type of jingle and jangle fallacies that I mentioned earlier. What do we mean by resilience? Do we mean that the person is just enduring and doesn't show negative effects when they are under incredible stress or adversity or trauma? Or do we mean some growth? And again, there are debates in the literature about that. I think a metacognition, again, can be used as a tool that would differentiate under what circumstances resilience would be, if you even see resilience, would be leading to some form of growth versus just a plateau and no difference whatsoever. But again, for resilience, it's also not clear to me, and this is another part of this jingle and jangle problem, whether it is a disposition or whether it is about how you handle a particular situation at hand. And I think to stress out, metacognition is more about, I think, the way how cognitive scientists, how cognitive psychologists, social psychologists like myself define it. We really focus more on the situation. What is happening to you when you experience something, when you're reflecting on something. It's less about what is your general disposition to, persevere in, which is actually what grit is supposed to be about.
Yeah. Well, can I possibly ask a follow-up to that? So if I enrich the definitions of both of them a little bit to see if that teases out a little more what the possible connection might be, given what you said about growth. So if I define resilience loosely as adaptability in the face of adversity, and by involving adaptability, it therefore has to involve some degree of growth in response to adversity. And if I define metacognition as involving two elements, metacognitive knowledge, so awareness of my own learning processes and what I know and my skill set and accuracy of how aware I am of where my skills are and knowledge is on a kind of spectrum, and self-regulation, the ability to adapt my learning in response to information I get about where my skills are, so to improve and so on. So therefore involving some degree of growth in response to the information I get. And that's, a fairly standard definition of metacognition. If then both definitions involve a degree of growth, does that illustrate for you a kind of possible connection between them based on your research on this?
Possibly. I think what's important to keep in mind there, I like it. I like this approach to find this kind of overlapping points. What is really important to keep in mind here is what level of analysis we're talking about. If you're talking about sort of individual growth, intra-individual growth, or are we talking about just studies showing different people responding differently to different situations, which is an entirely different level of analysis. So as long as we are clear about that, I do think that we could possibly find a connection specifically in the context of growth. But whether we grow from adversity or not, it's a big question. We hope we do, but as I said at the beginning, my personal experiences the last few weeks, I'm smiling right now, but I don't know if I grew. I don't think people in Ukraine are growing right now. I don't think people in Sri Lanka have been growing much when they experience their traumas, and it applies to so many parts of the world. So I think there's this hope. But in much of the research that my colleagues, for instance, Randa J. Vikrama and I have been involved in this range of projects, part of them funded by Templeton Foundation. And we try to look at signs of growth and the context of stress, military stress, other type of contexts, interpersonal conflicts. And what we see is just a flat line, horizontal line. We don't see much growth. So the baseline is not the number. You can spin it in a positive way. So like you don't see much of a decline either, but you don't see much growth either. Anyway, so that's just a chromatic comment on that. But yeah, I agree with you.
Great.
There is potentially a connection.
Well, thank you so much, Igor and Santushi, for that talk. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question, John. I would like to pass the microphone over to Ellen.
Thanks, Fiona. Hi, Igor and Santushi. It's really nice to hear from you both again. It's been a long time, but thanks for the fascinating presentation. I wanted to pick up actually on a slide, Igor, that you included in your presentation, which I hope I remembered it quickly. I wasn't fast enough to screenshot it, but it was the one where you were showing essentially the individual trajectories of different types of traumatic experiences. And there was sort of an average line that went throughout them. But one of the things that struck me is that if there's that level of variation, sort of in traumatic experiences, to what extent is there any possibility of being able to design, let's say, interventions, treatment programs, sort of anything like that? Or is the individual variety just too great? Like thinking about it from a translational perspective, what do we do with that data if you want to try to help people overcome trauma, for example? Sorry, I think you're on mute. Yeah, this is the one. Yeah.
Yeah, so you refer to this slide. Yeah, I think I think the answer to this question is something that most therapists probably do. I'm not a clinician, so maybe Santushi can actually speak to that. But from a theoretical perspective and from talking to my friends who are clinicians, there's always a bit of an adaptation. It's not like that you say, well, I know that I'm just doing CBT, and I will just be applying it in exactly the same way to all people that I encounter. No, you obviously take some kind of a contextual consideration into account, even for the CBT, even for the more rigorous approaches. And others are very specific about that. Like a client-centered approaches are very specific about that. You put the client in the center, you put the particular experience in the context that they have in the center. So I think this graph just emphasizes what practically many practitioners are doing, namely that they are not treating every single thing the same way. Now, the danger of that quite often is that it becomes very idiosyncratic, and sometimes you just do things that you think work. It's almost like a superstition that are not necessarily evidence-based, or is based on clinical studies. Samples are also very, very small, sometimes too small to make any strong inferences. And this type of data is hard to come by. Whether I would be taking this data, for instance, and drawing strong inferences about, oh, look, this is what you should be doing when you experience economic hardship as compared to when you have major trauma, as compared to focusing on students who've been, suffering so much over the course of the last few years with mental health crisis over the pandemic. Well, now it looks like on this graph that there are three different trajectories. But one thing to keep in mind is that we actually didn't have clinical samples here. So we don't know if these patterns, for instance, would look the same way if we get participants who are really suffering. Because, those people who are really suffering, they're not likely to participate in the study over time. So if we got people who then happened to experience and they were nice enough to contribute and continue reflecting on it, that's the data that we have. Anyway, so that's just like my very sort of like basic scientist had a perspective on it. But maybe Santushi, as a clinician or part clinician, can also speak to this.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a more person-centered therapeutic approach, it's about understanding how each challenge or each adversity were to affect the person. And if you were going into a CBT approach, you need to figure out what works for the person. So it's really dependent on the individual. And it's really difficult to come up with any generalization as to what might work or what might not.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate that the line is also focusing on essentially the wisdom score. So we're not talking about depression outcomes or anything like that. But it just it's just really striking, because if you think about the level of individualization in terms of experiences of trauma and sort of the lack of trained therapists around the world. Shahan Williams was talking about how he used to be, I think, 1 in a million psychiatrists in Sri Lanka. For example, it really just reinforces the fact that, this is a major sort of global health challenge in some ways that we don't necessarily have the tools to counter yet.
Yeah, and just like this is again a meta comment on that, but if you listen to folks like Stephen Hayes, who's a clinician and a psychometrician at the same time, he would be emphasizing that most of the models in clinical psychology about growth are based on approaches that are not adequate to capture growth in the first place, because those models assume universality in processes, whereas now, this shows that processes are not necessarily universal, so you cannot assume that the variability would look exactly the same, intra-individual variability within the person over time, the change would look exactly the same way. And so some of the statistical models that are even used to evaluate the data have been used, according to Hayes, over the course of the last 50 years or so in clinical psychology, are vastly inadequate. And part of it is also because until recently, and still, this type of longitudinal data is very difficult to get, especially at the scale that you need to be able to use more sophisticated models.
Another great question and answer. I'd like to pass the microphone over to David. David.
Thanks both for fascinating presentation. Lots of thoughts and lots of questions, as you would expect. When I first saw the title of the thought, I went back to my days in Sunday school and remembered the wisdom of Solomon, who, of course, was a wise old king when two ladies, or two prostitutes, as some texts call it, fought over a baby. You probably know the story. And each one claimed that the baby was hers. And of course, the wise King Solomon said, well, the only way to solve this problem, and he beckoned to one of his soldiers, was to bring a sharp sword to cut the baby in half. He said, each of you seem to make a strong argument for whose child it is. So each of you deserve half of this child. And one woman said, that is a good outcome. And the other said, this is, protested, of course. I'm sorry, I repeat the story, people probably know it, and said, this cannot be a good outcome. I love this child. You better give it to her, and I will walk away. Solomon then, of course, as a wise king in his wisdom, and this is why it's called the wisdom of Solomon, said, the woman who made the loudest protestations to save the child is clearly the mother of the child. And the child was then given to the mother who was prepared to walk away to save the child's life. So, obviously, sorry, I don't want to repeat a biblical story, and my Sunday school days were many, many years ago. But of course, this brings sharply into focus what people, and certainly in many cultures, think about as wisdom. And as your talk went on, I was rather puzzled about what the problem actually was. Now, there seem to be several problems. One is, and you, Igor, make a very strong motivation for ground clearing exercises on questions of concepts. Is there a difference between grit and resilience? Is there a difference between humility and whatever the opposite is, and so on? And are people talking about the same thing, and are they talking about different things? And we can go on and on and on. And of course, every time you put a concept, whatever it is, wisdom or anything like it, to a group of social scientists or political scientists, historians, in other disciplines, there will be a great deal of dispersion in the way in which they understand it. And as we know from the development of disciplines, many, many disciplines, the kind of bifurcation we have seen over the years that have led to sub-disciplines and more sub-disciplines have been precisely because of these ground clearing exercises, the attempt to get the best purchase on a particular concept, the best purchase, and so on. So, of course, you can, go on and on doing this and say, all right, let's get groups of people together, and invite them to a workshop and see if we can get a better purchase on a concept, and that may well be a worthwhile exercise. And so your work, Santushi, in Sri Lanka, and your work, Igor, and so on, and, nobody argues about this, because I think that's helpful for us as scientists, and we want to, and this university is very clear in its mission. It's about trying to, get to the truth, as it were. So we would always support that sort of approach. But the other thing you said is something that was even a bit more puzzling, that for me sort of evoked this notion that what we want to do is build wisdom. And build wisdom as a response to adversity. So I can sort of imagine a world in which there are hundreds of wise people walking around, reflecting in different ways about very terrible world problems. But I just can't see, necessarily a world like that. The world I see is the world you describe in Sri Lanka, of the Buddhist monks to whom people turn, or the Roman Catholic priests to whom people turn for counseling. And the world I see is, in terms of a lay person's understanding of wisdom, is to turn to the woman or the man who has lived through many adversities and who has seen many crises and brings to bear a sense of experience and understanding and deep insight. In fact, for Solomon, as if you speak to biblical people, they will say wisdom was given to Solomon by God, and that this came in a dream. So many scientists will talk of the value of perspective or intuition, or the ability to draw on to draw on experience or emotion, etc. So this is where I started to get, was kind of wondering, this is fantastic research, but I was just wondering whether in terms of, the research itself, whether you're dealing with a kind of problem of ecological validity, that we're trying to explore the word wisdom. And so it brings me back to Solomon. Was it in fact that Solomon was a wise king to have made that deduction, or was the woman who wanted to walk away from her baby in fact the wisest of the of the triad there? So what do those experiences tell us, and what do we learn from it? And so anyway, this is not a terribly well-formed question. It wasn't meant to be. It was certainly a number of reflections about, I can understand the purpose of trying to explore wisdom and get some clarity about it, and I can understand the difference between the etic and the emic approaches, and both produce some wonderful data, and it's absolutely fantastic. I can understand the urge, and particularly with funders being very interested, like Templeton, in how do we make this a better world, and the logic is all too often almost too simple, that if we had more wise people in the world, then it might be a better world. But the distance between A, understanding what wisdom is, B, producing, if you like, in this naive sense, more wise people in order to achieve it, and third, this idea that adversity or conflict or trauma of one kind or another is a pathway to, or potentially a pathway to wisdom, rather than potentially what I would call eye-opening events. So people would reflect today or tomorrow or in a year's time on Ukraine and Russia, and they would reflect on the Sinhalese and Tamil situation, and on many, many, many terrible situations of adversity. And many will say those situations opened our eyes. That's the lay person's language they would use. It opened our eyes. It gave us insight. But very few people, I suspect, would say those situations made us wiser. People reserve that word for very, very good reasons. So opening eyes, making us more empathetic, making us more understanding, enabling us to reflect on problems differently in a more sustained way. People will say all these things, and this is probably what they'll do. But whether or not they will ultimately say those situations made us wiser, I'm not so sure. But anyway, I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you so much. This was a very interesting reflection, and I guess there are several questions that are embedded in it. I could address this from the philosophy of science perspective, why we do science versus just ask people what they think, and who is right. But let's take that aside, because obviously quantum physics is not something that you can ask somebody on the street. So I aspire that in behavioral social sciences, there are also some things that lay people may believe that may not at all correspond to the psychological reality, some of which we may not necessarily be able to perceive immediately. Instead of that, I want to go back to the Solomon, because what's interesting about that example, and I've written extensively on Solomon, as some of you know, is that there is a quite substantial variability within Solomon in the Bible. When it came to judging decisions of other people, he has shown Solomon's wisdom. That's this example that you provided is one of them. When it came to his personal life, he was miserable and a fool. He was bragging about his wealth. He was like, didn't care about his son. He had like 500 pagan wives, all preaching to their gods and stuff like that. Well, okay, now, whether any of that is true, just exaggeration, so there is a sense of hubris that goes even with wisdom, it's beyond the point. What I want to point out is that this notion of wise people and wise persons, and having many wise persons out there, is a form of psychological essentialism that we as lay individuals often succumb to, especially in the Western world, where we believe that characteristics is an essential property of the person. And for wisdom, it's very salient. The way when you say, for instance, that there is this wisdom of wise individuals, and there are only a few of them. Whereas at the same time, and Santushi pointed it out a little bit when she was talking about, well, it's very hard for people to first come up with an idea of what is wisdom. But then when you start like breaking it down and focus on concrete experiences, they would think of, oh, maybe not this big wisdom, but small wisdom in people's lives, but particular events. And there's this distinction between this, I think, what our beliefs, lay beliefs are about sort of the wise people. And I think it's a mistake to even think that there is such a thing as wise people, because Solomon was not wise. And if Solomon was not wise consistently, in some situations he was, in others he was not. And we show dramatic variability in these characteristics, as some of my work has shown. You know, the chance that you will show the same type of wisdom, whatever you want to call it, openness, intellectual humility, perspective taking, in one situation, just because you have shown it in another situation, is like 5%. So that's the magnitude of overlap between one and another situation, because it's so much determined by the context. And so the idea of a wise person doesn't make sense to me. It's like developing wise people, that whole idea doesn't make sense to me, because it's I have yet to see somebody who is wise in all contexts and is not having either the moral or intellectual flaws in some domains of their lives. It's very high tall. I don't think it's possible. Instead of that, I'm thinking that we should be thinking about the wise judgment. As Santushi said, it was much easier for people to think about situations in people's lives where they saw somebody doing something, oh, well, that was actually very wise. And when we think about, I think, the experts whom we would turn to, either in the context of a crisis, adversity, or otherwise, we don't go to people who, for instance, had a traumatic experience to get financial advice, or an advice about the wisdom of, how to do some kind of, how to save the planet in the context of climate change or something like that. No, it's very specific. It's very context specific, and vice versa. You would not be asking a climate scientist about, marital advice. For different things, we already have these intuitions that a different type of characteristic, different type of strategies would apply, and you would go to different people to get that information. So bottom line, I think what we can then train, because then it comes to the question, well, how can you train it if it's so context specific? What we have to train is sensitivity to situations. We have to train awareness that whatever, if you want people to improve the interpersonal skills in the context of possible relationship conflicts, well, there you can train it using insights about how certain strategies may help in a relationship context. You should not be generalizing from that context to training skills in the context of working through a horrible trauma. You should not be generalizing from one trauma to another trauma. There is a certain degree of overlap, of course, but I think the approaches, and this is, as we discussed already earlier, I think something that clinicians do already. They treat each single situation as unique. They would not say, well, I just, this is say here, I call it the McKinsey approach. He said, we will solve all problems and we'll teach you how to do it in a 1 month workshop. And then you can go on and into the business and you can tell them how they can restructure their lives. Your 25-year-old will come, the new junior McKinsey partner, and will solve everything using the McKinsey formula. I don't think that works. It's silly. So I think for wisdom, that's the same thing. So we can train to make people slightly wiser in particular situations, in particular contexts, based on evidence that exists for this context. But we cannot really generalize beyond that. I think that would be an utopian idea, and I think it's based on a misconception of having this notion of wise people, which I think is very difficult to entertain based on the existing evidence.
David,
okay, thanks for that response. I mean, yeah, no, as I say, thanks for that reply. I think we can agree on one thing, and you know, my you know, is that you know, we may or may not have a few or many wise people in the world, and you know, the point about, you know, financial wisdom is very different, and clearly, you know, the people who you know, who provide financial advice, and they are big, you know, media stars and television stars, and people tune into their programs and they listen to them. And I don't think, you know, anyone is striving for a world in which, although people talk of financial literacy, nobody's striving for a world in which they think they can sort of up the game, that every person in the world becomes a financial wise person. You know, it's that life isn't like that. It's just that people are sensible about the way in which they use their money. So there aren't many training institutes that set their stall out to say, come to us and we're going to make you a wise man or a wise woman when it comes to finance or marital relationships or, you know, moral, biblical questions, and so on and so forth. So that wasn't the point at all. The point was, why hang hang out one's stall on a word that clearly has ecological validity problems? And this, I think, is a conclusion you yourself come to, that we can't call people's behaviors in their multitude of forms, in their multivarious ways, in these many situations that you refer to, economics and war and political and climate and so on, as situations in which everyone will react with the same level of integrity, the same level of reasonableness, the same level of sense, and so on. That would be an impossible world, to think that we can up the game and that everyone's dispositions, in whatever form we try to think of them, will grow in this way. It's clearly not possible. So the problem remains, in a sense. I mean, it's a fascinating area for research. Certainly, the question, what is wisdom? I think, as you have yourself done, written many papers on it, and there will be many more papers. And I think, it's a fascinating philosophical and psychological, it's an inviting problem, and there will be many discussions about it. The empirical side of it, about what is it that we're actually trying to persuade people towards? Is it wisdom, which is unclear in its meaning and form, or is it forms of responses that help them through traumas that have been experienced, or situations in which there is uncertainty about how to deal with it, like the current war in Ukraine, and so on? People are very uncertain about what to do, and we need people to help mediate those actions. But we're not trying to build wise people. We're trying to build people with some form of resistance, some form of resilience, some form of reasonability in how they act. And so for me, it was just, how do we bring all these different elements of your research together to, to try and find some sort of better clarity about what you put as a very inviting problem. Does wisdom grow as an outcome of adversity? It's a very difficult question to answer, and I think this kind of ground clearing for all of us has been very helpful. But I think it's a problem that we're going to have to continue to look at, I suppose. But for both of you, just really, really fantastic, and it's helped us all to think a lot more deeply about things that I suspect otherwise would be taken for granted. So fantastic work.
Thank you, David.
Ellen,
we have one final question, Ellen.
Yeah, sorry, I'll try to keep it brief because I know we're running out of time. But just to build a little bit on sort of David's very provocative comments, I'm wondering if, given the challenges that there are with essentially wisdom at the individual level and some of the sort of debate over whether we really want to strive for wise individuals or not, does that necessarily lead to better outcomes? It makes me think that, also Igor's comment, no such thing as wise people. But I would see that I think there is a space or place for wisdom in the world in terms of sort of the wisdom of humanity, if you want to say it at a very grand level. So it almost makes me think that maybe the type of wisdom that we need is not wise people, but we need wise decisions. And as a result, maybe what we really want to focus on is wise institutions. I mean, it's really hard to not consider the sort of global geopolitical context and thinking of, that it feels like history is in some ways repeating ourselves, and we're questioning whether there has been sort of learning from past conflicts. So I wonder if sort of applying the study of wisdom, taking it from the individual more to the systemic level, might be a way to overcome some of those challenges.
I think that's very wise, Ellen. I think that's very wise, and I think we've seen wise leaders throughout the years. If you look at, I don't know, there are many African leaders with lots of faults and many wives, like Julius Nyerere, or for example, but people who've sort of led countries. Some call Mahatma Gandhi a wise man, and in other parts of the world, his statues are being torn down for being a racist, and so on. But there have been many interesting public displays of wisdom and calmness and responses to difficult situations that I think have been very valuable for nations. So I think that would be my feeling, that we look at it as collective wisdom. We look at institutions, we look at leadership, and look at what we can learn in this kind of distributed cognition. The fact that it's not one person, but a whole experience of a society that, in a sense, propels leaders. So unlike Solomon, who claims to have been given wisdom, in a dream by God, actually people have risen to become wise leaders because of collective struggles, collective empathies, collective problems. And I think that is really a very wise way of perhaps looking at it. So thank you for that. I think that's great.
I'm aware that we're running out of time, but I wanted to say a few words, really, first of all, to thank all of you, the collective, for being here during the course of these seminars this term. I think we've got a really rich and diverse community, and all of the talks have been stimulating in their very different ways. So first of all, thank you for being part of this community. I would like to say special thanks to our speakers today, Santushi, who's staying up late into the night in Sri Lanka, And Igor, our hearts and prayers are with you and your family and your nation as it goes through these terrible times. So please accept our thanks, but also our thoughts. And from David and Luana and John and myself, really wonderful to see you, and thank you very much. And thank you TWCF also for supporting this series. So these seminars are available on Vimeo, hopefully if the recording goes all right. And see you this time.
Thank you so much for having us.
A pleasure.
Well then, Fiona, well then, for holding it together these 8 weeks.
I know.